Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where, in my own words, it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross pollinating the various building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. With a planetary civilization, I mean in the truest sense of my vision that we as human beings become aware that we're the dominant species on this planet. But there's many other sentient life forms on this planet. Animals, plants, but there's also seemingly non-sentient entities, at least in our Western background, like rivers and mountains and soil, that ultimately all carry, I think, something of that divine spark. And I think it's our collective duty, or sometimes use the word dharma, to steward that transition for the many generations after us. The context of today's conversation is logic. I would also say wisdom, and the biggest wealth transfer in the history of humanity. So, my distinguished guest on the other side of the screen, in between the United States and Guatemala, where I live, is Chelsea Toler. And like always in this podcast, I don't want to introduce you, Chelsea, but in the context of today's conversation, when I ask you about that pivotal moments in your biography, and you're welcome to share, maybe it's early childhood, maybe it's adolescence, maybe it's more recent things that happened in your biography that made you rethink on a very profound, on a code level, like who you are, what's your purpose, and what connects you to the conversation we're about to deep dive after this pivotal moments in your biography. So having said all of that, it's my great pleasure to share that podcast with you, Chelsea. We know each other now for 1.5 years. Thanks for your trust and having a vulnerable, honest, and authentic conversation. And yeah, curious to listen into the pivotal moments in your biography.
So I'll start with a pivotal moment that is more recent. And that is, I had the great pleasure of getting to sit in the Vatican Youth Symposium, actually right before we lost the last pope. But it was a culmination of some of the brightest young leaders, their minds, their projects, their interests in philanthropy, their interest in technology. And what was really cool about that particular experience is Jeffrey Sachs, who's been a mentor for a long time and a leading economist, he opened it up and said, you're in this space of the Vatican where faith and science can live and coexist. And so I loved that. I think that in everything that I work on now and the purpose that I hope to bring into the world, whether it's stewarding young leaders and their voices or working on important SDG initiatives, really combining purpose, what we believe, the heart and the mind with critical thinking, logic, and this wave of AI revolution. That's really where I'm most excited to sit right now.
Then I always find it interesting when some of my superstars show up. I was not aware that one of your mentors was Jeffrey Sachs. Do you mind sharing one or two examples in how far he influenced you, your thinking, your feeling, and your perception maybe of history?
Sure. So I would say this takes me back maybe to another pivotal moment. I had recently lost my grandmother, and she was really the staple of philanthropy and mentorship and education for me in my life. And so after we lost her, we decided that I would actually set up our family foundation and use it as learning capital and not just be about our own, but help other young women that were going to be a part of family offices or foundations make decisions. And so we hosted a little gathering, back then as kind of a small brunch launch of that. And I sat next to S.J. Murray, who is another fellow mentor of mine. And I thought about, and I said it to the room at the time, imagine what your life could be like if everyone had an S.J., if everyone had access to a mentor, if everyone had access to the knowledge, the wisdom that we need to pursue our purpose in our life. And what I really admire about Jeffrey Sachs is years later, I got to help work with United Nations, the name is very long, Sustainable Development Solutions Network for Youth, or UNSDSN. But he approved a project in which we actually got to work with young leaders and entrepreneurs and philanthropists and really invest in them and see some of those projects. But his passion for the youth and youth voices, which continues at the Vatican, continues at UNGA, and really approving that has allowed me to see the power of intergenerational collaboration. And I hope to see more leaders in these spaces allow for those young voices and their ideas and their passions to come to fruition.
I find it very interesting that towards the very beginning of the podcast, you mentioned Jeffrey Sachs, the connection of the mind and the heart, and the terminology that I'm very often using, which is intergenerational. So to ultimately steward not only wealth, but wisdom and knowledge for next gen wealth holders, to steward the wealth of the families in a meaningful, values aligned way for the many generations after us. Besides those two pivotal moments, is there a very recent one, maybe leading us into the next chapter of the podcast, like the genesis of Logictry?
Sure. So I'm a bit of a believer in destiny, for whatever that means to you. But you can be a believer in faith and destiny and also care about science and critical thinking and understand the massive technology advancements. And what I love about that is that is true to who my family has been. That's true to my partner and who I've married. That's true to watching my mom, who is a educator, and really kind of broke down some walls. I don't know, for folks calling in from Chicago, there's something called Fermi Lab, which used to be where lots of innovation and scientists came. But my mom actually helped set up preschools inside Fermi Lab so that the scientists, when they came, whether that be for a short stint or a very long time, their kids had education. And so watching that in combination with my father, who is a deep technologist, built a patent law firm alongside my mom, I got to sit at this really interesting intersection of a care for education and for top minds, but a passion for innovation and technology. So, to your question and why I talked about destiny, my co CEO and co founder and partner in life, Chris Fronda, invented Logictry on the exact same day that the United Nations held the first World Logic Day in the world. And we have the timestamp. We did not know each other, and even more perplexing, alongside Jeffrey Sachs was Sam Lonnie and some of the team at UNESCO that I was working with that actually was helping with some of that initiative that I had no idea that they, I would someday be able to partner with them on a startup that cared about critical thinking and logic and saw this whole AI revolution way ahead of, I think, most of the world. So the memory I'll share is we started as a small group of about 100 people saying, I think there's going to be a time in the world where we're going to have to decide crazy decisions like, do we want our brain implanted with plants? Will there be robots? What will we offload to AI? Things like ChatGPT, right? We were sitting and thinking about that about a year or so ago. That small group transitioned to 900 people, family offices, next generation leaders, experts, AI innovators, Fortune 500 companies, at the Long Center in Austin, Texas, really understanding that the future is really here now, and what are we going to do about it, whether it's the great wealth transfer or the AI revolution. How do we navigate this together? So my favorite thing that I get to share is that amazing destiny moment of this birth of Logictry. And now what I'm even more excited about is how do we help steward next gens through the great wealth transfer, but also experts and thought leaders through this revolution into a completely new world of technology, which can be, yes, advancing and solving things like cancer, but also we really need to protect our minds and our understanding of what it means to be human.
I think ultimately, when I look through you and sense through you, maybe even below, beyond, or before the heart, I would say it's a soul level, like a mutual recognition. Because I like your critical stance, especially on the AI revolution. In your own words, in as much as I think technology is always a double-edged sword, right? AI is an amazing tool for efficiency, but it seems already now, and we're kind of in the floppy disk stadium of AI, right? But very soon, we have exponential curves on exponential curves stacked. We will end up AI everywhere. Why do you think it's important to sometimes consciously circle back and ask us, what is it that makes us uniquely human, so that the machines that we built and the artificial intelligence that we built does not influence us in an unconscious way? And how does that influence the setup? I mean, less from a, let's say, back end perspective, but more from a first principles, governance, and curation perspective, how you did set up Logictry.
Difficult question, right? So I think if you can imagine back, so folks that are, millennials or older, you can kind of remember the transition into the internet, right? And and then even after the transition into the internet, then the acceleration of social media, right? And the good, the bad, the ugly, and yes, it comes with amazing things and being able to be connected with people all over the world. But it's also come with really difficult consequences on humanity. And we didn't have social media bullying when I grew up, and kudos to amazing next gens like Christian Elam who are taking that on from a policy stance and really thinking about how can we protect young people online. But that's just the beginning. And so if we think about, that blink in time before the internet, what if we had had all of the conversations that we could be having right now about who needs to be in these conversations, who needs to be thinking about the ethics, who needs to be thinking about where is AI going and who is it being deployed to, and how can we use it in schools and how can we protect people. And so I think that I don't know that we're adequately preparing from an education standpoint, whether that's in a company or in your school or in your home, for the massive transition that we're about to see. And I think there are a couple of people I'll shout out. Siniad, who was recently at the Vatican Youth Symposium and spoke a little bit about Gen Z and Gen Alpha and their perspective on AI. She's really great to follow to kind of learn. From a VC standpoint, we're working with 5IR. They're talking about the fifth industrial revolution, right? There are, if you look for it, sources of folks that are talking about these issues. But I think, what I hope to see, and what I hope to see with Logictree, we're doing it in massive cohorts and waves on topics with different experts. But really, we need additional partners that are telling people jobs are changing. Your job today is going to look very different than tomorrow. And if you don't jump on board and start to learn, we are going to be in trouble. And so I hope to see folks not only investing in AI, where a lot of capital is moving from an innovation standpoint, from an ROI standpoint, from a wealth standpoint, but where are those partners or those counterbalances of AI defense, which is where Logictree sits, of how do we make sure we're not leaving people behind and society behind in the excitement of this new wave?
I want to reciprocate with an intro without mentioning the name, but maybe that's new to you. So after that conversation, I'm happy to introduce you to a very fascinating AI expert who thinks that most of large language models are ultimately doomed to fail. They're complaining that they're already now running out of qualified data. When you look at the internet, round about 90% of what we call the internet is not publicly accessible. So we're down to 10%. And out of the remaining 10%, only around about 10% can be read by large language models. So we're down to 1%. So already now the biggest companies out there, all the well-known brands, right, and renegades in the AI sector that are propagating large language models are already now running out of data. So I think it's very interesting that you're very carefully selecting a curated network, especially for people that need to really trust the other human being in order to make very complex decisions. And not only, whatever, relying on, I would say, the general frantic hype moment of the very first generation of floppy disk large language models to influence how you transition family wealth. So I find that just really interesting in the context of AIs on the billboards everywhere, and people think on the floppy disk stadium, they're using ChatGPT for roundabout everything. And I really like your critical stance to just say, wait, can we circle back a little bit what makes us actually human and what are really experts that built up for decades and decades and decades, sometimes for generations, very specific knowledge. When we talk about knowledge, I think I was really touched actually to be chosen to be part of the expert network, because it seems you're not only interested in the business as usual expert knowledge. So before we dive into the launch of this curation of the expert network, what were guiding principles that made you sense and feel that these experts that you're inviting to interface with holders of wealth or next gen wealth holders hold up to the scrutiny of what your conjunction of your mind and heart tells you is the right way to go ahead?
So I challenge myself, and for other futurists out there, hopefully this resonates. But Alistair knows this, and some of his friends have watched my frustration escalate over the last few years. But it's kind of odd to know that something's coming and to be able to see it and try to tell everyone around you, hey, this thing is coming. Hey, we really need to pay attention. But really, to channel myself and to challenge myself that it's okay to have to wait until the world is ready. I'll explain why I'm talking about that and what that means. So, I don't know, I've probably been championing next gen education and initiatives for over 11 years, and I'm 32. I can remember sitting at Google. I guess this is a pivotal moment. We had started, there were about 35 of us, other next gens, but together, I think about 2 weeks before the official pandemic and the entire city of Austin shut down, including the canceling of South by Southwest, we did have the mayor tell us we were the largest last event officially in Austin before the shutdown. But this group of 35, we had dreamed up this idea of having large scale conferences and meetings and collaboration rather than gatekeeping. So VCs, family offices, some of the UN folks and team actually joined us, one of which was young at the time activist. She was working closely with Greta, Alexandra Villasenora, crazy people from, members of the Gamble family, like really, really amazing thought leaders in different spaces, from environment to family office to venture. But the world was going to shut down, right? And we didn't know that, but I saw in person accelerate that change. And I saw, young people. Alexandra, I think, was 14 at the time. She hadn't signed her fancy deals yet, right? Sitting with, JP Morgan and the Gamble family. And I saw that learning that when tragedy hit, because that trust had been formed, the capital movement exploded alongside it. So when someone needed a private plane and needed research in vaccines, the money went. And when a young person somehow needed to get online to get access to somebody across the world, a tech company that they had met in Austin made it happen, right? All of these things happened at an accelerated pace. And I keep talking about this blink of time that we have to prepare, but I mean that, and that is now, both for AI revolution, but also for this great wealth transfer. So back to why I've been frustrated, and here we are. Most folks in this space know the statistic. 90% of family offices fail within 3 generations. We know this. We also know for the first time in history, it seems like mainly women are getting access to capital way more in decision making than they have ever in history, right? So, but what that means is we have a need for an accelerated rate of education. At the same time, and I talked a little bit about my concern about critical thinking, we've seen a rapid decline in critical thinking and critical thinking being taught in education, right? They're on social media, they're offloading their decisions. Most of them are using ChatGPT. Teachers are using ChatGPT, which is not bad, but we have to protect and prepare for both, right? So as I've challenged myself over the last 10 years, but to, constantly be the one kind of beating the drum around, we have to educate the next generation what they are seeing. We can't wait until they're 45 to expect them to know what to do with their capital. Same thing with experts. We cannot wait to teach them. What they expected in their life as a job is drastically going to change. And so, are we doing it perfectly? Absolutely not. But have we developed our own proprietary methods in which we're looking for very specific skill sets, both of the mind and the heart, with our experts, and very specific next generation leaders, innovators, and wealth holders to move us into the future? I can only hope that people get to be involved in these kind of ecosystems, because I know what it would have meant for me in my own journey, and I hope to make sure that others have access to education and these resources faster than I have.
Then I always call it diamonds or pearls of wisdom or the nuggets to convey. I think we're roundabout in the middle, at an inflection point in the conversation. So you're going to unveil in a couple of days. I don't know, we're going to publish that podcast in a couple of weeks. So after the publication of the first collection, can you share more with the listeners? Because you shared what influenced choosing the experts, but do you mind sharing some of the examples? I don't know, you can mention names, you don't have to mention names. What makes this collection of knowledge and wisdom unique, and why do you think that this is so important for next gen wealth holders?
Sure. So, in terms of my PhD research looked at next gens in family business, community education, inheritors, but in some of that research we see whether they're actually inheritors or not, this upcoming generation holds two key things that they really need support and help with. The first is decision making. There's so much information, right? So much. How do we find what we need? And even if we find what we need, how do we know that we're making a good decision? The second is purpose. So when we designed this cohort of experts and resources that are building, we looked for folks that had niche information or wisdom or interest that could really alleviate some important decisions in the next generation's lives, and folks that had a really great pathway or framework or community in which next gens could find purpose. In addition to that, we're super excited to have longtime friends and supporters, Louise and Hans, with the Story Sunday Afternoon Project. Their focus is storytelling. They actually are South by Southwest official press. They have an amazing story. I think Alistair's wife even knows them, from Guatemala. And they've, I've watched them navigate unparalleled journeys of coming to America and being able to be together, of having a business and actually having to shut it down because their investor felt that they were too gay. And so watching folks like that be able to navigate that in the press in America, in PR, they really have you wouldn't think about this, but a unique ability specifically for next gens, because a lot of people don't talk about this, but as next gens, we're scared to share our stories. We're scared of what the world is going to think about us in a way that the average person may not be. So when we say, hey, we like that nonprofit, or we like this company, or here's our stance politically, it feels like, why would we share if when we share we might just get scrutiny that we're not expecting? I think a lot of folks think, oh, next gens have it easy, right? Their parents or their grandparents were so successful and they have everything handed to them, and it's an easy journey. But the research actually shows us that 1 in 7 of next gen inheritors will develop a mental health disorder. 1 in 3 can be as serious as an attempted suicide or drug or addiction. And I guess another interesting piece on my journey is I've fortunately and unfortunately had the pleasure of knowing some of the most talented next gens in the world. And I've simultaneously been to several funerals now of next gens that were in their 20s, right? So back to the collection and why. We partnered with Louise and Hans to help the experts through the process, and also to help some of the next gens through the process of really tackling a collection around decisions and purpose. I'll share my favorite moment of this. So we had kind of a combined call, and some of the experts I think understand that some of the experts are next gens and families, and some are, communities, and it's different. But if they weren't, it became very clear. I won't share who it is because that's not the point, but probably one of the most accomplished next gens I know, in terms of fundraising, in terms of influencing companies to care about environment and corporate social responsibility. She actually said that she felt like an imposter on the call. She didn't know if she was good enough to be an expert. And I guess the question that you didn't ask, but I'll answer, is why are we doing this? And I think that is because I have seen over and over again the loudest voice get the most attention, but sometimes those with such great stories and wisdom and care and things that they can bring to the world, uncertain of how to share that. And so if we can be that bridge, that's what we want to do.
Yeah, I want to paraphrase. I don't know if Louis or Hans have shared that when they asked what would be the right psychotherapist for an A-class star on the Cannes red carpet. So what I think makes this collection really unique, it's really not only financial experts. There's coaches, there's therapists, there's people in, I would say, cultural change, there's activists, there's also obviously those that need to know the nitty gritty of whatever family wealth transfer. But do you mind maybe cherry picking, since you're short before unveiling, a couple of the collection pieces that like kind of were unexpected and nevertheless that you chose to unveil because they're so unique to the collection?
So our group kind of laughed about this, but someone started the title, From Prenups to Podcasts, and that kind of stuck. I don't know if we're officially going to name it that, but I would say the most surprising but also effective piece is there's a pretty well known in the learning space for family offices contributor, that really put together kind of, and she's going to put more and release more of this as we get closer to June 1st, but thought leadership around a prenup. I can share. I am somebody that was married at 19 and got divorced and had a very tumultuous conversation around why on earth would I need a prenup. And since then, I've been asked to talk to young girls of family members and share my story, right? And you can believe in love and still understand how to protect yourself in the world. That's my opinion. Everyone can have their own. But at a minimum, what she built is a resource to kind of make the right decision for you, right? And what are the things that you should be considering? What are some of the questions that you should talk to your parents about if you're navigating that, or your spouse? And so I thought that resource was really cool. Another one, I talk about this all of the time, but board service is such a awesome way for next gens to kind of dip their toe into their purpose, right? Whether it's a nonprofit or for profit or a fund. Kelly Wilson, who has won one of our World Logic Day awards, also served under Casey Rotter, who, out of her PhD, developed this really unique fundraising next gen model for UNICEF, where next gen members from all over the world get together and actually plan and curate fundraising initiatives, particularly for UNICEF. So Kelly put together her kind of how to checklist on how to discover a board and what that means. I thought that was another great one. This is more radical. I'm dropping a few of these. If you pay attention to my Instagram, some people think it's funny, but I call them next gen drops, where I've received various information that next gens didn't want to share publicly. But it was inspired by one of those. I had a next gen submission say, Chelsea, it would be really helpful if you put together the key questions that you used to ask your financial advisors if you care about the environment and impact in the world. And so how do you navigate that? And so I was a little nervous about this. You can see on my LinkedIn, I kind of went back and forth on the decision, but I decided to release, my personal recommendations of questions that should be more at the forefront of some of these next gen bank advisor, financial advisor conversations. So my hope in doing that is when you're vulnerable, you inspire others to be vulnerable. And I have a suspicion based on some of my conversations with our experts to date that we're going to start to see some really amazing resources and wisdom sharing, not just from a tactical, here's how to be a next gen, but how do you deal with the complexities of everything from divorce to finance conversations to where you go to school to what you want to do with your life?
Yeah, let's throw some love and some confetti in a very Alistair way around you. As some of the listeners know, I'm a trained macroeconomist. And I don't want to throw numbers around, but give more comparison. So the comparison is that wealth transfer in the next 20 years is round about the sum total of the five biggest economies on the planet. If we are aware that some families hold more wealth than some smaller nation states combined per year, you're actually opening, curating, and holding the sacred boundaries in a space where people can truly influence the direction of whole economies. I don't want to share maybe examples, but what makes you that person to trust yourself and those around you that you're really a conduit for the next generations and not like there's some fancy backdoor open in your personal family foundation for Chelsea and nepotism around that. So it has more to do ultimately, really, when I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that soul connection, I really sense the purity of your intention. And ultimately, I think that's all we have as human beings. If we meditate or not, or if we pray, or if we believe in Jesus Christ, or it doesn't really matter, right? The purity in our hearts, right, is that what ultimately makes us a conduit. And I think that's a very transpersonal calling, meaning it actually doesn't have that much to do with Chelsea Toler or that much to do with Alistair. It's how do you curate a space, in that sense, Logictry, and make sure this space and the purity of it doesn't get hijacked. So I'm not too sure how to frame that into a question, but it almost feels like, how do you keep your space clean? What are some housekeeping rules if in the future you were to sense that some of the experts are trying to hijack the pure intention behind Logictree? Yeah, kind of housekeeping rules. Do you have that written down or loosely formulated? Yeah, curious about that.
Yeah, so I think the first part of kind of what you're sharing hits on something really important back to purpose, right? I think sometimes when you feel like you are headed in your path that the world has brought to you, you can say no and it'll keep coming around. So for me, my initial path was I would take over my family's law firm. I would go to law school. I had thought about, maybe I could even do patent law potentially. But instead of being excited about my law school classes, I found myself at a nonprofit clinic about 3 streets over. And the nonprofit clinic was dealing with immigrants that had, were seeking asylum and different things. I don't know how familiar folks are with Texas, but that's a pretty big issue in Texas. Not only just the border, but even what to do with the folks that have immigrated here legally and how do they get resources. And I still remember just this. Sometimes you have these very clear memories of like important decisions. And there was one day I went into the nonprofit clinic. I was, terrified of the law school finals I had, but I felt happier there than maybe I have my whole life because I could help people get access to the information and the resources and the tools that I know that they needed to find their potential to live their purpose in their life. And I just had this moment of this isn't being a lawyer and taking over the firm and all the things that I had thought for my whole life was going to be my path. It just didn't fit. And so, I had a very open conversation with my family about that. I think next gens a lot of times have that decision. Do I go into the family business? Do I not? Do I fit with this legacy? Do I not? Right. And luckily, I have amazing parents that, realize, just sometimes your path that you have for your child may not look exactly like you think it does, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be amazing. So would I imagine from sitting, a law school dropout that I would get to speak at the United Nations, that I would get to sit with some of the legacy highest net worth families in the world and talk about what could their daughters do and how do we make sure that they're prepared? Did I think that we could, some of which was successful, some was not, during a pandemic, organize private planes and hundreds of millions of dollars to help rescue and get doctors what they need in New York, right? Could I imagine all of these things? And I think about this often. What if I had just continued to go down the path that I knew was wrong? So for me, and, can I answer, am I the right person? And is Chris the right person? Gosh, I don't know anybody else who cares as much about logic as Chris does. Or do I think that he is so gifted in being able to have that heart for teaching and for the world, but that technical knowledge of AI that the world needs? And I think for me, I often find that I can speak to or help families and next gens work through where they need to go to find their purpose and live their life. So I would say, do we have everything written down? No. Do we have a basic, compass and moral code and a plan? Do we have a council plan? Do we know kind of the process in which we're going to do our very best to protect what we believe is what Chris and I were destined to bring into the world together? Yeah, we're going to protect it with everything that we have. Even to date, we've turned down massive funders because they just didn't have the same value systems or want to see what we do. But I'm also not going to lie and say that that's easy. I think for most startup founders or for folks or even for next gens, the assumption is, oh, you have access to everything. What do you need? Well, the answer is a lot. To Alistair's point, like money in terms of full economies are changing, and we need to see support going into philanthropy, next gen education, experts, training on AI at the same rate that we're seeing capital go into crypto and politics and AI bots, right? So long-winded answer, but I think my advice is when you're on the right path and when you found your purpose, and hopefully there's nothing that prevents you from believing in yourself.
I like how you answered it, and I really love the humility that speaks through you in between the lines. Let's make it a little bit simpler. So you're unveiling an amazing collection, some of which are really world-renowned experts and LinkedIn influencers, but I also truly appreciate the odd ones out, those that usually would fall out of the bell curve, those with expert knowledge and wisdom that, for me, I was very positively surprised for that space to be open, including from myself, to curate some provocative thought pieces or some pieces of background information that I really think are important for next gen wealth holders to at least be able to receive in order to fine tune their compass or deepen their purpose. Um, let's make the question a little bit simpler before we segue into the next part of the conversation. What would be orange flags, but you think you could still moderate them? And what would be hard red flags in the context of that expert circle?
Oh man, you're pressing me on our secrets. Well, one which shouldn't be a secret, although it has happened multiple times, which Chris and I actually laugh a little bit about. If they don't believe that logic and critical thinking is important, you're probably not the right fit. I think that we actually see that quite a bit. We've even had people say, "Well, why does logic matter?" And I think part of that is a misunderstanding because of how logic has been used kind of in an accusatory or biased way in pop culture as a result of, you know, kind of just our adaptation or interpretation. But the literal meaning of logic is the science of correct reasoning, right? So if you see the trends in artificial reasoning, you should probably understand that the logic behind that human reasoning, the correct reasoning, is going to play a very important role in the future and in some of the things that we're seeing from a science and technology perspective. Other flags. Chris and I, we worked on our values and our core tenets. So I think, like any company, you should find people that align with those. Some of those include collaboration, right? So we are not for the folks that want to hold all of their information tightly and never give it to the world. We are for the people that want to collaborate, believe that information and knowledge for the better purpose of all should be shared. Another big one we're not going to negotiate on: education. That's so dear to us. I still am not quite sure, but there are some people that just don't even believe in education, and it's changing. And I think that that's a big one, or that don't have the same kind of heart for educators that we do. Other things I would say, forcing your own decisions or not being open to the fact that you could be wrong. One of the reasons that Chris created Logictry, there is a principle that was shared with us by Marianne Talbot out of Oxford, which Chris followed all of her courses there on logic. And it's called the principle of charity, which means you come to every conversation thinking that you could be wrong, or there could be information, or you could be misunderstanding someone. So for folks that just have an agenda and just want to push their way and aren't open to, thinking about, could we be misunderstanding, or could we, really reason through this to find collaboration and peace, those are some hard no's. Orange is tougher. I would just say have a good attitude. I think folks that come to the table with a genuine heart and good attitude for the group, and for the cohort aspect, which we've done on purpose, of a community aspect of releasing information, I guess that would be an orange flag.
I'm a big fan of the Horizon 1, 2, 3 model. I'm really using that in most of my podcasts. And I don't want to frame the Horizon 1, 2, 3 model. I just want to roughly say, for me, the Horizon 1 is like kind of what you ultimately, want to achieve in a short frame of time. Usually that's like, for example, in a year. The Horizon 2 is more like big picture, but still tangible. You can still plan it in OKRs. Let's say a couple of years. And then usually the third horizon, and you're free to pick either one time horizon, is you either pick like a birthday, right? Maybe when you turn 40. Or it could be really your legacy when you hand down everything that you hope you have accomplished in your lifetime to the next generations. So, just to frame how I, in this context of the podcast, use the Horizon 1, 2, 3 framework. So, with everything that you aim to birth onto the planet with Logictry in that very first collection, what is your biggest aspiration on a Horizon 1?
Biggest aspiration for, I guess, this Horizon 1 or initial launch is that the next generation realizes that the burden that we think we have, or this future that we're inheriting, um, that we can take it on, that we can believe in ourselves, that we can, as a society, regardless of the fact that we have huge issues like climate change and that we have huge problems like kids still don't have food and girls can still not go to school in certain countries, and in some rooms we can't even agree because there's wars and we don't even know how to talk to each other. I guess like all of these mountains that seem insurmountable to climb, I just think sometimes we need a minute to pause on the hope. And so I guess the collection, even in my own life, for me, this was a pause for the hopeful, for the resources of, how do we deal with that divorce? Okay. How do we deal with, joining our very first community of learning? How do we deal with Alistair put together a really cool one on spiral dynamics for next gens, right? How do we challenge our brains, our minds? How do we navigate AI, right? So yeah, my oddly in the space of a creative and somebody that really loves being in intellectual conversations of the mind and wisdom, this for me was about hope.
Then let's give a metaphor for the Horizon 2, but also for the Horizon 3 from a living systems perspective. So when you look how living systems develop and also how logic trees, right, develop, it's usually on the intersection, on bifurcation points in the unknown we're sailing. So there's a reason why I feel so deeply committed. So when I received your invitation, do I make myself available and commit a certain amount of hours and not just a small chunk each month to be of service with what makes me truly unique? Because the interesting thing is you did not only ask my company, but truly me as a human being. And I hold something very unique: my personal development, my healing journey, my meditative practice, my macroeconomist knowledge. So let's try to paraphrase that for a Horizon 2 question. Imagine your carefully selected acupuncture points in the next gen family office system are fruitful. What is a high aspiration maybe for the next 3 or 5 years? What do you see will sprout? What are some of the seedlings out there that you see blossoming?
To seek your own ability to make decisions for yourself and to learn, not to just take the information, or that you have to fit in a certain box or a certain model, or not to pick on institutions, but if you don't have control over all of your wealth, that you don't matter. um, you don't actually have to wait to live your life or to make a difference. And I think, Logictry, yes, because it represents knowledge and the study of logic, but what we're actually doing, whether you're an expert that we've brought into our cohort, or you're a next gen member, or even a family, these are seeds that we hope plant for the future. I think that, you know, Chris and I both have been futurists in our own ways. For him, it's been technology. He's seen and just built already for some of the things that we're concerned about with AI and integrating that, but also how do we protect people and making sure that humans have a way to make money still and to matter and their voices should matter. For me, with next gens, I mentioned this before, but I saw ahead that this wealth transfer, which seems far and in the distance, is happening, but in reality, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, um, one mentor, Dr. Rudin, told me he starts teaching them about philanthropy and the planet and impact at age 3, right? I think that we're already behind in terms of what we've educated our 20-year-olds, our 30-year-olds, our 40-year-olds on, not just from a financial literacy perspective, but from how to really collaborate. I think there's been not so much of a need for families to collaborate in the same way that we see that now. Last thing I'll share on that is, why do we host World Logic Day, or why logic beyond just critical thinking and what I've already said about AI? We know from thought leaders like Audrey, the director of UNESCO, that they believe critical thinking and logic and teaching that is our way to world peace. So if we can learn how to better debate and to argue, so to speak, but in reality, it's really navigate differences of opinions. If we can do that at a global scale, we can find our way back to center. And families are a huge leverage piece in that, right? So if some of these high net worth family offices can learn how to not make the mistakes of putting the money over our families and people, or putting AI and technology and the fascination over humans and society, it's it's a big vision, Alistair, but if I can make a dent in it, that's what I would hope for Horizon too.
Well, I certainly want to go way more visionary, and let's paraphrase that. So, when my parents, my siblings, and some of my oldest friends suddenly asked me, okay, Alistair, you studied macroeconomics, you're suddenly in the middle of structuring multi-billion-dollar asset conversations. Why do you think that family offices can be a very much needed force on a global scale for systemic change? I think there are very few human beings out there, I would include myself and you, for example, that have the cognitive complexity and can hold the emotional paradoxes of having this privilege to really think and feel in intergenerational time spans. So the Horizon 3 question, and I don't mind exactly the time horizon you're using, really has more to do with, okay, we're a decade or a couple of decades in the future. There's trillions, and just for reference for those listening who haven't studied macroeconomics, that's the size of the whole GDP of a country like Germany that have moved in a different direction, or the whole GDP of the United States that have moved into a different direction. So, where do you see in your wild dreams that this is going? And where do you sense Logictry maybe in 10 or 20 years?
So, you know how when you buy an Apple phone or a computer, why do you buy from Apple, right? Is it the cute Apple logo that reminds us of trees and learning? Maybe. Um, is it Steve Jobs because we all kind of want to be a little bit like Steve Jobs, right? To build something big in the world that makes a difference? Is it because we feel smarter or an innovator? Is it because we like Apple as a brand, right? All of these considerations. For me, I meet people sometimes that, and it's happened rarely in my life, but there are a few people when you meet them, you just kind of know. You're like, wow, I will put money behind that person. I will put resources behind that person. I would trust that that person, because of who they are, is going to build something that changes the world. that was the exact feeling that I had the first day that I met Chris. I'd come from a Nexus conference, and the whole theme was about not just being about your name or, what you're with, but like, what are you passionate about? What do you actually want to do in the world? Right. And I'd come back to Texas and I was a little frustrated because I kept going to happy hours and they were like, well, what are you doing? And, what are you investing in? And it just felt all very surface level. And I sat down with Chris, and the first question he asked me was, what was I passionate about and why? And over 45 days in New York, I had gone from Austin to New York to lead a conference there. Um, we really got to understand each other's values, what we wanted to see, and that there was so much alignment with that. And so when I think about, what do I want to see on a personal level? I want to see the dream that he has and the dream that I have for the world to care, for the world to be safe, for the world to have wisdom that's captured and humanity that's captured in a place where, maybe wars aren't completely gone, but at a minimum, we have the tools to try and find our way back to peace. That's one thing I want to see.
So, to close this conversation, Chelsea, I think when I trust in the purity of your heart, right, which is ultimately, what connects both of us, in the context of your responsibility, and really trusting that your vulnerability inspires other next gen wealth holders, I really wish for Logictree to make a profound impact on how next gen wealth holders perceive themselves. Do not only learn critical thinking, but critical feeling, so that they themselves trust themselves, find their purpose, and understand actually the huge amount of lever and impact they can have with the wealth that they're handing over to the next generation. Chelsea, thanks so much for the conversation. I'm really super curious where this will go together. I reckon we will see each other at the latest in New York during Climate Week. Are there any closing words that you want to share, Chelsea?
I would say closing words I would like to share is if it doesn't scare you, you're not dreaming big enough. And I think that every day I wake up a little terrified of, can we really do this? Can we really make this change? Are we the right people? David and Goliath, right? Logictree, we started small and now we're gaining traction, but is it possible for the small young innovators to take on the world? And I hope to see in that Horizon 3 that Logictree is just one of many young companies with a power duo and a massive network of awesome experts that can take on the challenges of our times.
Thanks. I would also like to close with that. So, dear listeners, if you're not afraid of your biggest dreams and visions, you're not bold enough. And I really like that. Chelsea, thanks so much for the conversation.